the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. It's the nation's premier water quality statute, and it's also one of the most effective environmental statutes that's ever been passed. It was passed when our rivers, streams, lakes, and oceans were in huge trouble. The Santa Barbara oil spill had happened. The Cuyahoga River was on fire. Lake Erie was effectively declared biologically dead. We had rivers like the Androscoggin in Maine that were so polluted that were peeling paint off nearby buildings. So we had a huge water crisis, and the Clean Water Act basically comprehensively protected all waters against unregulated dumping of pollution, and it put in place effectively two permit programs for that. One called the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System Program, which requires permits for things like sewage dumping and industrial dumping, ensuring that does not occur unless treatment occurs, to make sure it's clean. And the other program is called the Section 404 program, which regulates dredge and fill into waters, and that largely is kind of targeted at wetlands and streams that would be filled or buried or dredged as a result of development or other activity. And in addition to kind of the water pollution crisis we had in our rivers, lakes, and streams, we were also losing wetlands at that time at a rapid pace. We lost something in the few years before the Clean Water Act was passed. Wetlands, the area of size of Maryland, had been lost in just a few years. So we were at a rapid decline in wetlands, and the act was incredibly effective. I mean, it brought many waters that were just dangerous to swim in or to fish in back to life, where now a lot of those waters are places that people absolutely go and they fish, they swim, they pull the fish out, they're safe to eat. So one of our most effective statutes. One of the reasons that the statute is so effective is how comprehensive it was. The statute protects, by definition, waters of the United States, and through from the Nixon administration when it was passed through to the Obama administration, that term had been interpreted very broadly to protect basically as many surface waters as possible, including all the small streams, the washes that you oftentimes see in the Southwest, as well as wetlands that are clearly important to wildlife and perform a lot of functions like flood control and water recharge, but may not be connected directly to other larger waters. There were a couple cases starting in 2000 that put into doubt some of the scope of those protections. One in 2001 that called into question the protection of small isolated waters, like ponds and playa lakes and prairie potholes and waters of that nature. Then there was kind of a confusing decision that came out in 2006. But that decision, the kind of prevailing opinion that came out of that still had an ecological lens, and allowed EPA and the Corps to protect waters that had an ecological connection to other larger waters. So we get to the Sackett decision, and in that 2006 decision, there were 4 justices who kind of threw ecology out the door and said, well, waters kind of mean what real men waters think mean. They've used this 1956 definition that unless a water was continuously flowing, standing, or permanent, the Clean Water Act didn't protect it, and that it only kind of incidentally protected some wetlands that had a continuous surface connection to other waters, such that it was impossible to know when one water stopped and the other water began. In the Sackett case, which was issued in 2003, that really restrictive view prevailed. And the Supreme Court held that the Clean Water Act only covered wetlands with a continuous surface connection to other protected waters that are relatively permanent or continuously flowing or standing. So obviously in a place like the Southwest, you don't have many of those waters. EPA followed suit with a rule that curtailed a much more expansive rule to conform to this decision, with the effect, according to EPA, of the removal of protection of up to 63% of previously protected wetlands, and that's area, and up to at least 5 million miles of stream, or up to 5 million miles of stream. So broad-reaching impacts across all states, but particularly hard hit in areas like the Southwest, as I mentioned earlier, where there's just not a lot of flow year-round. There's rain events and snowmelt are the main things that feed a lot of these waters, and those are pretty intermittent or ephemeral. It also affected a lot of depressional isolated waters in places like the Great Plains, but also the isolated waters in places like the Southwest, where you've got a lot of playa lakes. And the impact to states was further heightened because a lot of state regulatory programs depend on Clean Water Act jurisdiction. For instance, states have the ability to ensure that federally licensed projects conform to water quality under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. But with a scaled back jurisdiction, Section 401 does not apply now to a lot of projects. And in a state like New Mexico, its MPDES program, which is the permitting program that regulates end of pipe discharges into lakes and streams, is governed by EPA. So that's coterminous with the federal jurisdiction. So all of the great wetland and small stream values are at risk, and when they're at risk, pollution downstream is at risk, and not just pollution downstream, but with climate change, a lot of these functions are becoming more and more important. So obviously, there's drinking water supply. At least 117 million Americans get their drinking water from rivers and streams that are now at risk. You get the loss of the filtering ability. The best way to clean water is to clean water at its source. Wetlands are the Brita filters of nature. They do a great job of filtering pollutants out of water before they flow downstream, before they flow to our tap. Wetlands are a huge natural mitigation against flood risk. 1 acre of wetlands can store up to 1 million gallons of water. So when you're losing those on the landscape, when you get some of the really severe storms we're seeing with climate change, that water is much more likely to just rush immediately downstream and cause flooding impacts. And obviously, it provides critical wildlife habitat, as well as access to outdoor recreation and corridors for movement. About a third of all threatened and endangered species rely on wetlands for some part of their life cycle. So this map shows the impact on New Mexico, which is one of the most impacted states. But this map would look very similar in a place like Arizona or Nevada, and to a lesser extent somewhere like Colorado, and parts of California, particularly kind of the Central Valley and some arid parts, Mojave Desert, et cetera. So you see, most of the stream mile, all the washes, et cetera, in New Mexico are unlikely protected, and these are all of the headwaters that eventually flow into major rivers like the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe. So in the Southwest, a huge loss of protections. And with the federal protections gone, what's left for a lot of these waters are state protections. But as this map shows, state protections are actually inconsistent at best. Really only about half of the states have some sort of protections that are meaningful for the type of waters that have been stripped of federal protections. And a lot of the areas that the states that don't have protections are some of the states with some of the highest risks, a lot in the Great Plains, in the West where you have drier conditions, or a lot of depressional wetlands. And even in states, like California, that has a strong wetlands program, with the state being asked to do so much more than it was previously asked to do, with the Corps of Engineers no longer protecting as many wetlands under the Clean Water Act, there's a resource problem. So they just don't have the people to do the extra work. And state budgets are not necessarily plentiful. So even states with good laws on the books are struggling to find the people power to go do the work that they need to do now that they have more work to do. Just a couple of quick things, and then I'll turn it over. In terms of how people think about this, we did some polling, mostly in Mississippi River states, but this is reflecting some other polling. There's huge bipartisan support for the Clean Water Act. It's a very popular statute. People support clean water. They like clean water. They want to make sure that what comes out of their tap is safe. There's also very little knowledge of the Sackett decision or what it means. But when the Sackett decision is explained to people, there's high bipartisan concern and opposition to what the Sackett decision means for them. We also learned kind of how people think about wetlands. Most people associate wetlands with habitat. They think about critters when they think about wetlands. But when they're thought to think about wetlands as the Brita filters that impact what comes out of their tap, or natural defenses against floods and other natural disasters, they're much more inclined to want to protect them. So how we talk about wetlands and think about wetlands is very important to kind of how people prioritize their protection. So what is NWF doing about this crisis? And I really want to state that this is probably the biggest crisis in water quality that we've faced since the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. We're really looking at it kind of in three prongs or three buckets. Ultimately, we need Congress to step up and fix the damage done by the Supreme Court. Only Congress can do this. The Supreme Court decision was such that it tied the hands of EPA and other agencies to protect more than what the Supreme Court determined the Clean Water Act protected. So we need Congress to come in and right the ship there and reaffirm that the protections that had existed since the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 was actually what it intended. So Congress needs to come in and clarify that and restore those protections. But in the meantime, waters are going to be polluted and wetlands and streams are going to be lost. So we have to maintain, enhance state level protections. Right now we've got campaigns, and I know that HO is participating in some of these in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Illinois to push broader protections in those states, to put backstop protections. We are doing defense. There are some states like Tennessee that actually have a decent wetlands law in place, but now that developers have seen that the federal law has gone away, that they're going after the state law too. So we're having to play defense in some of those states. And then we're also looking at, what can we do at the local level, at the tribal level to support, clean water protection. So that way we're not losing waters, we're not facing more pollution. And then, we need to build momentum and build champions for, nationwide fix while we also, in addition to the states, also look for other federal authorities to protect wetlands. And some of those are, using the FEMA's floodplain insurance regulations to hopefully give more incentives for communities that participate in that to protect flooding. Doing things like, through the Farm Bill, there's programs of the Farm Bill that provide either incentives for protections or penalties for destruction of wetlands. So doing everything we can to enhance protections in other places.
Alicia Mars, the Director of Western Water for NWF, and I thought I would throw up a very recent photo of water in Tucson, just east of Tucson here. This is Rincon Creek out by where my grandma lives. And we're really fortunate right now to actually have water flowing, given the pretty decent precipitation we've had down here lately. But this is just one of my favorite little free-flowing streams that happens every once in a while and really hasn't flown very regularly the last few years, other than, well, last year, but the last couple decades, I should say. So one of the reasons I wanted to put this up in particular, not only because I know that you all might actually appreciate seeing water and saguaros next to each other, but the Western Water Program traditionally has really focused its efforts for NWF in the Northern Rockies in Montana, and that's where my predecessor was based. I've been with NWF for a little over a year now. So I know definitely enough about the organization to be dangerous, and am actively seeking ways to grow our work beyond the great work that's happening in Montana and really expand throughout the West, including down here in Southern Arizona and throughout the Colorado River Basin and in the Upper Rio Grande. So I'll just move on from there and you'll see some of the stock photos that traditionally are here, but really the Western Water Program generally, obviously, as the National Wildlife Federation, our primary goal, and this comes straight out of what is currently our strategic plan, but we're reworking that as an organization right now, but really to focus on restoring natural function and quality of our nation's waters. And this includes wetlands and floodplains and riparian areas, but also those, waterways, arroyos and washes and areas that a lot of us here in the Southwest are really familiar with and to their importance. For both the fish and wildlife that depend on them, but also the communities that depend on them, which is just as important, and the communities that depend on the fish and wildlife, so the full system. The Western Water Program, our focus areas primarily are on riparian connectivity and headwaters conservation, and then we do dip a little bit to help with policy to kind of round out this whole focus. But it's really an effort, again, to look at the whole picture of what water means in the West. One of our primary, I'll say helpers or natural engineers are beavers. And this is the foundation to a lot of our work in Montana. We've got a great, one of my staff is up there full-time. Well, we have a few, and we're about to have 4 folks that work in terms of beaver coexistence. And so they work through a state wildlife management program that's collaborative with partners from across the state, at the state level, the federal level, NGOs, local landowners that are working to restore beavers on the landscape, but in a positive and constructive way. So we do a lot of conflict management and get out on the landscape with our partners, because beavers are really beneficial to maintaining healthy riverscapes and for the sake of land and water management. I bring this up because I do know that there's nascent efforts right now in both Colorado and New Mexico to think a little bit more about how we can restore beaver populations in both of those states, as well as efforts happening down here in Arizona to reintroduce beavers into certain areas that they may have been historically, but have moved on from. And even recent efforts to, as an example, reintroduce beavers to, say, in the San Pedro River down here in Southern Arizona. The beavers actually moved on, went upriver and went across the border to Mexico. So they go where they can find water and they can do their work. But the BLM will actually be using some of their IRA investment funds on that focal landscape to work with Arizona Department of Fish and Game to reintroduce beavers again in this landscape to see if they can do the restoration work for us. So thinking about, this idea of riparian connectivity and restoration, we have a few ways that we're approaching it. Primarily we're looking at ways that we can identify and promote and advocate riparian restoration and conservation opportunities. And this is at all scales. This is at the local level, so working with partners to build coalitions, but also, working at the federal level to advocate for increased funding or actual programs, sustained programs that can support these aquatic resources. A lot of our work kind of flows through the network or the nexus of land and water management. So I spend a lot of time working with BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and colleagues there, and partners to really help BLM kind of accelerate their adoption of restoration practices like using nature-based solutions. Beavers are one of them. You can do beaver mimicry activities like building beaver dam analogs, which are basically our interpretation of a beaver dam. And, that is an alternative to putting beavers on the landscape, but to mimic the role that they could play. We're also really actively wanting to make sure that we leverage and learn from efforts that are already locally successful on the landscape and find ways to really lift those up. And so a great example of that is the Ribbons of Life initiative that we've been, I guess facilitating would be probably the right word, in the Upper Rio Grande for the past few years. And ECHO was a really important part of the very first aspect of that. So some of you may have participated in the series of assessments that we did to really get an idea of all the different pieces that go into actively leveraging resources, whether they be cultural or policy, actual funding, or federal funding and state and local funding, but also the physical restoration activities as well to restore riparian habitat throughout the Upper Rio Grande. And one of the things that sets this effort apart is that it's a transboundary approach. A lot of the work, as many of you probably know, and politics in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, things kind of tend to stop at the border there between the two states, but the Rio Grande obviously does not. And so one of the reasons this coalition was brought together was to find ways to leverage knowledge and expertise for our shared desire to really restore and reconnect not just the river, but the people that depend on it. So through the series of assessments and through a series of partner meetings that we've held over the last few years, we've developed an action plan. It is quite large. It's a 5-year plan that's trying to pull together a variety of opportunities for us to not only acknowledge and lift up the work that's already happening. So there are some really great local organizations, the Pueblos, conservation districts on both sides in both states that are already doing a lot of great restoration work. That's included in there, but also to really highlight the priorities and the needs so that we can use this document as a way to coalesce around this effort, but also to shine a light when we're talking to congressional delegations or state leaders or federal agencies to really highlight the need to invest in restoration and water protection activities in this region in particular, and to really articulate and show all the great things that are happening and could happen through riparian connectivity or restoring it. We also, one of the other, as I mentioned, pillars of the Western Water Program is headwaters conservation. And so the primary way that we're working on this right now, and some of you have been part of this, is the Healthy Headwaters Alliance. And this is a group of water innovators from across the West that come together. It's kind of, I like to call it a think tank, basically, that's focused on headwaters conservation for the sake of protecting our water resources. So thinking about protecting our forests so that we have clean and sustainable and available drinking water in our towns and cities. I think the fire that happened near Las Vegas, New Mexico, a few years ago is a great example of the importance of having resilient forests and how that can impact our waters. And so one of the products that's come out of this group most recently is this forest and water assessment, which I think, trying to remember we interviewed a couple of you. Are we still on? For this, Devin, I know I interviewed you. Yep. And so we've just kind of finalized this. This was my predecessor's legacy project as she was wrapping up her time with NWF, and it's looking at ways, it's quite comprehensive, that we can really leverage this amazing influx of federal funds that we've seen in recent years to the benefit of really restoring headwaters for the sake of all of our communities, but also through the lens of how the philanthropic community can support these efforts and kind of, where can they fill in the gaps, especially, where the federal funds can't fill, and looking to the future where we know we will not have the same amount of sustained investment. So this group gets together once a month. We have hourly calls, and we dive into, a variety of topics. Next month, we will be meeting to talk about an innovative project that the National Forest Foundation is doing with the Salt River Project in Arizona, in terms of watershed protection for the sake of wildfire mitigation. So if any of you would be interested in joining us, we'd love to have you come on. And we also, think about ways that we can actively engage and advocate in the policy world. And there's limitations to some of the members of our group because we do have federal agencies that participate, but there's, ways we can work around that, and they can be our technical experts as we kind of think about how we can engage in these spaces. And then I'll just kind of wrap up with, what we do in the policy space. Most of our policy work comes from our headquarters folks where Jim sits. But we are trying to, provide Western expertise where we can. And a lot of my work does involve really advocating for these programs that are really important to our Western communities. So the BLM Aquatic Resources Program is a really great example of that, and a real primary focus of mine right now, and finding ways that we can build social capital to really empower them to do more restoration work to protect and conserve the aquatic resources that they have. We don't often think about BLM as a water management agency, but they really do provide or hold a lot of responsibility in our rivers and our streams. And the lands that hold them. So thinking, at the moment, that agency is very interested in collaborating and finding ways to really increase their abilities in this space and build their capacity and partnerships. So it's an exciting time to be working with them on that. And then, also just thinking about ways that we can build awareness and an understanding of, our water and our aquatic resources in the West. I take this really personally when I think about the Southwest in particular. I think, just going through trying to find images for slides, I almost often never can find anything that's not, your traditional Montana upper, headwaters of the Colorado River, beautiful, lush, green landscapes. But there's really important aquatic resources in our more arid landscapes that are just as critical, if not more so, to find ways to protect and conserve and restore.